up in the Netherlands, and they immigrated during the economic crisis that followed World War II in Europe. And my grandmother was actually, she was just a little girl during the German occupation of the Netherlands. But she still has quite a few memories of how they had to go one winter just surviving on essentially turnips and tulip bulbs.
Mohammed Hamadaniel to the office, please.
Oh.
Mohammed Hamadaniel to the office.
Okay, we need to explain. Ellen is giving a speech today at her. Is this your former high school, Ellen?
It's my former high school.
Okay, so she's giving a speech today at the high school, and so she's there at the high school ready. So we may have a couple of other announcements come over the loudspeaker there while she's talking with us. Unfortunately,
I'm sorry, I didn't anticipate that.
Okay, so go ahead. We're talking about your grandparents and.
Yeah, so my grandmother, even though she was quite young, she still has some pretty vivid memories of the war, and she had a brother who was supposed to be called up for forced labor in Germany, and he was about 20, but of course the circumstances that they were going to be working under were horrible, so he went into hiding, ended up getting diphtheria, but because they couldn't call a doctor for risk of being exposed, he ended up passing away at age 20. So while none of my Dutch family was on a battlefield or anything, they still had a very intimate experience with World War II.
Mm. And so I'm guessing growing up, you heard stories of the World War experience, which I did too from my grandparents. Is that what interested you in historical fiction, or have you always been interested in it?
It definitely played a big role. I think, as I mentioned before, when I did that big camping trip of Europe when I was younger, that sort of planted a real seed. We visited so many interesting places on that trip, but what really struck an emotional chord was going to some of these battlefields, standing in craters from bombs that exploded during World War One. We went to the field in a French village where my great uncle's plane was shot down, and we actually found a debris from the engine. And so things like that, it brought history to life in me in a way that I'd never experienced before, just reading out of textbooks or being in school. And I think for me, always as a reader, historical fiction is always what's spoken to me the most.
Mm. And so all of the characters are fictional in your book, The Dutch Wife, but the story is rooted in historical fact. And so let's begin with that, Ellen. Because this is a story that I have heard before, but it is very little known. So tell us how you first got the idea for this book, where that interest sparked.
Well, when I first started thinking about this novel, I was really focused on trying to look at what happened during the Holocaust from a slightly different angle. And specifically, I was really curious about the German perspective of the war. I by this time was starting to live in Europe, and I had friends and colleagues who were German, and I thought, from growing up in a North American perspective, I've always looked at the war in a very black and white way, that we were on the right side and the Germans were on the wrong side. And so I wanted to kind of explore the mindset of what you could call an ordinary German citizen who got thrown into the middle of the war, and how they became involved in some of the horrific things that the Nazis were doing and how they justified their actions. And that was sort of the root of the story. And I really wanted to introduce a strong female perspective into the novel to offset this perspective of an SS officer. And so I was trying to think of how I could do that. And that's how I ended up stumbling across the existence of these camp brothels in the concentration camps.
Mm. And so it was in 1942, you write in the historical note at the back of your book. In 1942, under Himmler's orders, the first prisoners' brothels opened at a concentration camp and one of its sub-camps. And basically, some women were given the choice to go basically work themselves to death or to go into the brothel. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it sort of varied. Some were, oh, excuse me,
Okay.
the bell. I think that should be the last one. So some women were just forced. They were just carted off without really any choice of their fate. What happens in my novel, and is a reflection of how the women were chosen for selection at Buchenwald camp, where my novel takes place, is that the SS officers made an initial selection of women and asked out of this selection who would be willing to volunteer. And they sort of tried to entice them with these promise of these really good living conditions that were much, much better than the life-threatening circumstances that these women were currently living in the camp at Ravensbrück. And they were also promising some freedom, that they would release the prisoners after 6 months. Of course, this wasn't true, but I think if you're faced with a decision that could be life and death, something that you would never consider otherwise may ultimately be the choice you have to make.
Right, right. And that's the choice that your character had to make. So I think we're going to take a quick break here, and we'll introduce your main characters when we come back. The book is called The Dutch Wife. It's a debut novel, already winning prizes, receiving accolades. It's doing very well. My guest, of course, is Ellen Keith, and we will be right back. You're listening to Conversations Live with Vicky St. Clair.
Parkinson's disease affects as many as 1 million people in the United States. At the Parkinson's Disease Foundation, it's our mission to beat this disease. To learn about the Parkinson's Disease Foundation, or if you want to help support our work, visit our website, pdf.org, or call us at 800-457-6676. In the Northwest, contact the Northwest Parkinson's Foundation at nwpf.org.
At Sundown Communications, we find that most of our clients are brilliant at what they do, but they lack the time and resources to write and create business messaging that delivers results. That's where we come in, providing a diverse range of professional copywriting services for fresh strategic web content, PR, advertising and promotion, marketing, speeches, and much more. Call us today so you can focus on what you do best, and we'll do the rest. Call 800-495-7617. That's 800-495-7617.
180 over 111, and I had a stroke. I couldn't speak or walk.
150 over 90, and I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure sounds like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from silent. Get back on your treatment plan or talk with your doctor to create a plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
Head to toe, everything's changed.
Brought to you by the American Stroke Association, American Medical Association, and the Ad Council.
Hi, this is Vicky St. Clair. If you have a business, service, or event and would like to deliver your message to a large audience, call me at 425-269-4772. Let Conversations Live shine the spotlight on you. Call 425-269-4772. Thanks for listening to Conversations Live with Vicky St. Clair. Find out about upcoming shows at conversationslive.net.
Want to hear something different from talk radio? Keep your dial on Alternative Talk 1150.
Welcome back, everybody. You are listening to Conversations Live with Vicky St. Clair. My guest is author Ellen Keith. Her new book, The Dutch Wife. It's actually been out a little while, but it's just gone international. It's the winner of the HarperCollins UBC Prize for Best New Fiction. And I should explain up front, Ellen is joining us from a high school, her old high school in Alberta, Canada today, even though she normally lives in Amsterdam. But she's joining us from there today. She's giving us a speech, and occasionally we might get a little announcement come over the loudspeakers. I'm just warning you. So, all right. So we've talked, Ellen, about the true story of Himmler ordering these brothel camps be set up and giving women, some women, the choice: go into labor camps where you're almost certainly going to die, or come work in the brothel and we'll let you go after 6 months, which was not true, but a difficult choice for people to make, and women were given that choice. And so your main character in the book is Marijke de Graaf, and she and her husband are arrested. They're deported to different concentration camps in Germany, And she is one of those women who's given that difficult choice. Here she is, a married woman in love with her husband. You can go to the labor camp or you can go work in the brothel. So tell us about her and why she made this choice.
So Marika and her husband are in the resistance, and they are arrested for their involvement in making crystal radios for the underground to use and for people to listen to the BBC from the occupied Netherlands. And yes, initially she's sent to this women's camp at Ravensbrück in Germany. And when the SS officers come to do the selection for women to go to the brothel, she recognizes the name of the camp that her husband's been sent to. So as she's standing there, she has to make the decision, is this something, my marriage vows, that I'm willing to jeopardize or sacrifice with the hopes of finding my husband and letting him know that I'm alive? And she ends up doing that, and that sets everything else in the story in motion.
Right, right. And so tell us a little bit about her as a protagonist, how you developed that character. Is there any of you in her, any of your feisty grandmother in her?
Yes, I think, as you noticed, the dedication in the novel is to my grandmother, and I think my grandmother is definitely one of the most spirited women I know. She's in her 80s, but she still has more wit and quicker comebacks than anyone else I can think of. And she's definitely not afraid to speak her mind. And I think that's kind of a reflection of a Dutch character in general. From my experience, I've lived in Amsterdam 5 years now, and I find the Dutch to be quite direct, sometimes to the point of being very blunt, but you always know exactly what they're thinking, and they're not afraid to stand up for their opinions. And I really wanted to capture that in Marika's character. She is in a very dangerous, life-threatening position, but she still manages to keep her own spirits up and those of the women around her because she is so strong.
Right, right. I want to read the dedication that you made to your grandmother in the book. To my grandmother, Harmion Deus, I hope I said her name right.
Yes.
Who lived and lost during the war and left everything behind in pursuit of love. And then in parentheses, your G-rated copy is on its way. Did she get a G-rated copy? Or
No, in the end, she got the original. And she did a survey, I think, of everyone who's living in her seniors condo to ask them what they thought of the more graphic content in some of the scenes of the novel.
And what was the consensus?
I think overall, most of them said, you know, we've lived through all this. A lot of them lived through the occupation of the Netherlands, and they said nothing can shock us at this stage.
Yeah, interesting. So the story, you have a second storyline set into the book, woven through the book. This second storyline is set in the late 1970s in Argentina during the Argentine Dirty War. What was the significance of including that second storyline for you?
Well, I don't want to give too much away, but
Right.
let's just say there is a link between the characters that comes out gradually through the novel. But for me, on a broader scale, I really was struck by so much of the conflicts that happened across the world in the 20th century and how you see history repeating itself again and again. And when I visited Argentina, I was very moved by the sight of all of these mothers and grandmothers marching around the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. And they're holding all these signs and photos of their sons, daughters, grandchildren who have been missing for decades. And they're demanding answers and more transparency from the government. And I was really, very moved by that, and also intrigued by all the connections that Argentina has with Europe and especially with Nazi Germany. And so I wanted to find ways to show those kind of parallels between these different regimes and how they treated their citizens. And so I think a lot of what the characters go through in the novels, whether it's the treatment of homosexual prisoners or the close proximity that the officers had who were overseeing the prisoners to actually the living quarters of the prisoners themselves, and how these kind of regular luxurious life carried on for the officers while people were suffering only meters away. And that was really striking to me.
Right. And of course, your other leading protagonist is SS officer Karl Muller, who himself struggles with this situation.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, I really wanted to get this German perspective in it and to try and look a little bit at the psychology of the perpetrator. And he was a really hard character to pin down. I had to go through a lot of drafts trying to get his character right. Some people who read it early on felt that he was far too nice, far too likable, and that he wasn't quite involved enough in the day-to-day running of the camp. And but it's difficult. I think as a writer, you become quite attached to your characters, and you don't always want to force them to do bad things. So it was a really interesting learning process for me trying to write his character.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. So as a writer, I mean, it does raise a lot of questions and, ethical concerns, questions about, what lines would we cross when they become blurred like that. But as a writer, how do you define good and evil?
I don't think it's very clear cut. I think it really depends on what position we find ourselves in, and our own opinion of good and evil, I think, can shift a lot. I think I tried to force my characters in this book to do things that are quite questionable in some ways, that would put their own morals into question. And I think that's a reflection of our reality. It's really easy for us to look at a situation from the outside and say, oh, if I had been, say, a plane is crashing, I would be the one that would stay till the end trying to help everyone out rather than being the first off the plane. We can make those judgments, but it's really hard to know until we're in a situation where we fall on that spectrum of good and evil, or selfish and selfless.
Yeah, there's a quote at the beginning of your book, which is so true, I think. It is, in fact, far easier to act under conditions of tyranny than to think, by Hannah Arendt. So what do you think, again, as a writer, what can be forgiven, what cannot be forgiven? Where do those lines cross?
That's a really, really good question. Again, I think it really depends on the person you're asking. I think you really always need to consider the circumstances that someone is in. I think also if we look today at political or ideological differences, if you're just judging a person from their position and not really having a chance to talk to them and understand their perspective, it's a lot easier to say that something that they're doing is unforgivable or to cast judgment. But I think at the end of the day, it is really important to try and engage to the point that we can understand a little bit more before we decide whether or not we're going to forgive.
Right, right. So you've traveled extensively. My mother always used to say it's the best education in the world, and I would agree with her. How has traveling for this book, researching and writing it, how has that changed you?
It was a very all-immersive process. I think the most valuable research that I felt I did in terms of what enabled me to really get into the heart of the story was visiting these concentration camps and visiting Buenos Aires myself. I made a couple of trips to Buchenwald, and one when I first started writing the novel, and one when I just handed in the manuscript to my editor. And it was very powerful to be able to stand there where I envisioned my character standing, to see the remnants of this camp brothel, to see the stone stairways of the officers' villas that were still standing. And I think it's so different learning about the Holocaust or what happened in the war when you're actually there in the middle of it. In my apartment in Amsterdam, we have a newspaper hanging on the wall from 1940 that was found during renovations of our bathroom. They uncovered a hiding spot that had been built during the war.
Wow.
For people to hide in our bathroom. And that's something that I'd never experienced before living in Europe and really feeling so much closer to the war. and that type of research really being there physically, being able to travel and also I think be exposed to people's different ways of thinking really informed a lot of the plot and the character development in my novel.
Yeah, yeah. And so you live in Amsterdam now, and I know you live and work there. Back in a cubicle, I read on
Yes.
but you know, at least you're out there traveling and doing stuff. I've always thought Amsterdam was a place I'd like to live, you know, and I imagine myself cycling down by the canals, going to pick up my bread and my cheese and stuff. But what's the reality of it like there? It's quite a bustling place now.
Oh, but it is still exactly what you envision, you know, cycling. I cycle to work every day, even in January, even when it's pouring rain. Um, I was saying I'm back in Canada visiting family this weekend, and I've been feeling car sick all week because I'm not used to being in vehicles anymore. And so it
Right.
really is the reality. And of course, the city is becoming more and more touristy with every passing year, but there are still so many quiet pockets of the city, beautiful neighborhoods. If you go in spring when the flowers are out. It's really a stunning city.
And what do you think is a key takeaway that we North Americans could take from Amsterdam and incorporate into our lifestyle to make it better?
I think, yeah, two things. The cycling, it really helps you slow yourself down. And I think the nice thing about cycling, when you're on a road and passing other cyclists, you're making eye contact face to face. And I think so often when we're in our cars and, you know, we're on the highway driving to work in the morning, we become so caught up in our own little bubble, and other drivers are just vehicles to us. And it's really different when you have that face to face contact with people. And just on a broader level, I think what the Dutch do so well, and Europeans as general, is they really take the time to have a good work-life balance, not to put too much pressure on themselves, and really give themselves the time to have a very nice, very relaxed meal with friends where they're not in a rush. It's not just about the eating, but it's really about savoring the moment and the company.
Yeah, love it, love it. Well, Ellen Keith, such a pleasure talking with you. We managed to get through the school bells and the school announcements there, so good luck with your speech that you're giving to your high school there. Final quick thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, I think just for me, if you're not normally a historical fiction reader, I would say give it a chance. I think it's the best way not only to learn about history, it brings things alive and it totally new light, but it also teaches us a lot about what's going on in our world today. I see so many reflections in other books that I read that are so relevant today. And if you want to take a step back and have a different perspective of what's going on around you, try picking up a historical fiction book.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ellen Keith, for being with us today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
You can find out more about Ellen at ellenkeith.ca, ellenkeith.ca, and the book again, The Dutch Wife. Well, please stay with us. When we come back, we'll be joined by Sarah Smarsh with her debut book, Heartland. You're listening to Conversations Live with Vicky St. Clair.
Let's see if I guess that this just isn't working.
Knowing you have a great idea for a book is one thing, writing it another. So what's stopping you? Maybe you can't find time. Maybe you don't know where to begin. Maybe you wrote a couple of chapters, then disappeared down a rabbit hole. Or maybe you'd rather someone else write it for you. Partnering with the right coach or ghostwriter can make all the difference between talking about your book and finishing your book. As an award-winning writer and strategic consultant, Vicky St. Clair's storytelling credits span from business, health, self-help, and memoir to New York Times and USA Today best-selling anthologies. Vicky partners with people just like you at the exact level you need, whether you need a little encouragement, editorial guidance, or full-blown ghostwriting and consulting services. If you're serious about telling the story you know is inside you, stop procrastinating. Let's get your story down on paper. Contact Vicky today. Email Vicky at VickySt. Clair.com or call 1-800-495-6900. 7617. See more about Vicki and her work at VickiSt.Clair.com.
Yeah, that could work. Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair airs live every Monday at noon. And now you can also catch the show during drive time at 6 a.m. every Friday. Hear from New York Times bestselling authors, innovative business leaders, cutting-edge health and wellness professionals, award-winning journalists, filmmakers, explorers, and adventurers. Tune in to Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair, Mondays at noon Pacific Time and Fridays at 6 a.m. right here on Alternative Talk 1150.
Looking for unconditional love, an exercise buddy, or a great listener? Paws has the dog or cat of your dreams, just waiting to meet you. We've made thousands of perfect matches since 1967 because everyone needs a warm, safe place to call home. Find out more today at paws.org or call 425-787-2500.
Did you know that capsizing boats and people falling overboard account for over 70% of boating fatalities? 80% of those fatalities occur on boats under 26 feet and on boats with operators who've had no formal boating instruction. 50% of all boating accidents involve alcohol. Be smart this summer. Know who you're boating with. Wear a Coast Guard-approved life jacket and don't drink and boat. This message is brought to you by supporters of Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair and the JMB Group, who wish you safe boating fun.
Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair has a new Facebook page, so you can see what's happening on our show and what we're up to between shows. Like us on Facebook and look out for upcoming contest drawings.
Easy on the ears, good for the soul. Alternative Talk 1150.
And welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Well, we are joined now by Sarah Smarsh. Her new book is called Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. Sarah's articles on class and the working poor have been published by Harper's, the New York Times, NewYorker.com, and many, many others. Some of her most recent essays are on the activism of low-income women and underreported progressive uprisings in the so-called red states. She has an MFA in nonfiction writing from Columbia University and was recently a fellow at Harvard University's Sharon Stein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy. Sarah Smarsh, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on, Vicki.
It is my pleasure, and congratulations. You've written a ton of stuff, but this is your first book, undoubtedly not your last. Some of the things that are being said about it, let's just begin with that. It's described as an eye-opening story of working class, as searing, timely, blazingly eloquent, as a powerful message of class bias, a challenge to look beyond tired stereotypes of the rural Midwest. And Barbara Ehrenreich, actually one of my favorite authors, Barbara Ehrenreich, author of Nickel and Dimed, says, you might think that a book about growing up poor on a Kansas farm would qualify as sociology, and Heartland certainly does, but this book is so much more. It is poetry of the wind and snow, the two-lane roads running through the wheat, the summer nights when work-drained families drink and dance under the prairie sky. There's quite a nice blurb to get for the front of your book there from Barbara.
It was, and a humbling one, to be sure.
Yeah. So you researched this book and wrote it over the course of a 15-year period. What started this for you, Sarah? What compelled you to put 15 years of your life into this?
You know, it's hard sometimes to answer these questions that at the helm of the creative process can feel sort of mystical and mysterious. But the best I can tell you is that even as a kid, I had a natural predisposition as a writer, and I suppose I was going to end up writing about something. I also had an awareness of my family as kind of a cast of particularly extreme and wild characters in some way. And as I got a little older and began to understand kind of our place in the American story, I realized what a dearth of such stories exist in contemporary literature and popular culture. So, I felt like I had perhaps the right qualifications to bring a story forth about a place and a class and a people that is either ignored or stereotyped. So it really began as, I guess, a kind of personal mission, and then it expanded to kind of a more public awareness and hoping to be in service to some bigger conversation.
I was reading the New York Times book review on it, and they said in there that this book belongs really in its own section in the nonfiction aisles across the country. Maybe America's post-industrial decline, or perhaps simply class. And you say that class is not was not mentioned when you were growing up.
Yeah, I think that we just now are at this moment in this relatively young United States of America when we are in some sort of mainstream way really reckoning with the extent to which our society is indeed a class structure, and many of the strata in that structure are far more crystallized and difficult to transcend than we have been telling ourselves with this idea about the American dream and working hard and getting what you earn. So I think that, there earlier in my journalism career, I found that editors at UK-based publications were often more amenable to the themes of my writing, and I started to kind of develop a theory that just, not to say that class issues aren't pervasive in the UK, but at least the conversation has been acknowledged and had for far longer than in the U.S. So yeah, it feels like it's certainly not a new story, but there is a new willingness to face it at this moment of historic wealth inequality.
Yes, that is interesting because obviously growing up in England, class is talked about actually quite a bit. Sure. Certainly when I was growing up. And with my grandparents, especially because they came from a Victorian era. So that was very predominant then. And one of the things I always understood about America before I moved here and when I first moved here was that it's a classless society, which I very quickly felt it was not.
Right.
It just maybe we weren't talking about it.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah. So what made you want to tell the story in the way you did it? And it's part memoir, it's been described as part social analysis, part cultural commentary.
I think I really, even though I've made my living as a journalist, the book project really began with the memoir piece. So I always had this sort of bifurcated existence as a writer. So I was kind of a mercenary, making my money as a scribe, writing all sorts of things. And then this project that felt like really kind of my life's work, even as a very young writer, I had in a drawer, and I would take it out and work on it when I could. And in those years, it was really about my family and just, plainly telling the stories that for no purpose other than that they had happened, and I believed that they were valuable and deserved to be read. So some of the passages in this book were literally written when I was like 22 years old about some of the memories of the farm I grew up on and so on. I'm 38 now. Then as I kind of alluded to earlier, the bigger picture of the context in which my family lived came into view, and my own sort of class journey really equipped me with the language for articulating what was going on and why, when I was a first-generation college student, I didn't know that term at the time, and there was very little language for describing my particular experience and what made me a sort of other in some ways in the context of higher education. Is like you can't really, I felt at a gut level that there was something increasingly rare in the American story about my life experience for being rural, and also timeless in some ways as well. So then I folded those that public awareness in at later points in the writing process.
Right. And just to give a synopsis of how you grew up here, I'm going to read this from the book jacket because it says it perfectly well. Born a fifth-generation Kansas wheat farmer on her paternal side, and the daughter of generations of teen mothers on your maternal side. you grew up in a family of laborers trapped in a cycle of poverty, people who basically aged far beyond their years because they worked nonstop, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's almost surreal to me even now, after many years of writing about class and considering the terms that we use for describing things like poverty. It nonetheless feels weird to have you read that description, because when I was in that moment, I did not by any stretch of the imagination think of myself as poor. We had enough to eat. We had a roof over our heads, and as far as we're concerned, that was, I don't know if we never dealt in class terminology, but if someone would have asked us, I suppose we would have fancied ourselves middle class or something, just because we weren't starving. Of course, we were incredibly economically disadvantaged, and that, as you noted, it revealed itself on our very bodies. So much of the work done in the place I'm from is physical, manual, and taxing in a way that makes class a reality that's felt not just politically or psychologically or socially, but just at the physical level of the body.
Right, right. One of the things I took away is what great characters you were surrounded by. Your grandfather, Arnie, his wife, Betty, who was your maternal grandmother.
Yes.
What a life that lady had.
Yeah, and I have to say, I can't imagine that this book would exist without her, because when I was mentioning earlier that as a very young budding writer, I was first setting my sights on my family, really she was the central character in my understanding that there was something really compelling about the story swirling around me. And that was because, she's sort of a bigger than life figure, and in many ways she led a particularly chaotic life, even within the context of the reliably chaotic experience of poverty. And she's just a really cool lady, and witty and funny, and my writing, like anyone's, has strengths and weaknesses. I suppose what I often hear that there's good dialogue in what I write, and I just say, like, well, that's not my doing. That's the storytellers and the sharp-witted, mostly women who I was raised by.
Yeah, generations of single moms, and I read that you attribute part of your escape, if you will, from that life to the fact that you did not become a single mom.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about poverty and class, we should always be careful to tend to the ways in which it intersects with race, gender, and myriad other identity demographics. So as for the gender piece, being as far back as I can trace my direct maternal line, every woman had her first pregnancy as a teenager, and I was just keenly aware of that as a kid, and I'm not sure, I didn't know it in any sort of like in the way of knowledge, the way that, statistics about poverty and pregnancy, but I felt it because, my mom struggled. She had a hard row as a very young mother, and I was the direct witness to those struggles, and I understood somehow, just at a gut level, that they in part had to do with the fact that I existed, which has everything to do with the relationship between being a female body and being poor.
Mm. We need to take a quick break. Lots more questions for you, Sarah, when we come back.
Thanks.
My guest is Sarah Smarsh. Her new book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. You're listening to Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair. Please stay with us.
There's a bridge This is Martha Norwalk. Every Sunday morning beginning at 9 a.m., thanks in part to the Northwest School of Animal Massage, we cover the world of animals. This week, September 23rd, it's another Behavior Training and Healing Sunday with me. As an animal behavior therapist and trainer, I'd love to hear from you with any behavior training or healing questions you have about your animal friends. You can also call in about any animal-related issue or cause you'd like to talk about. Open phone lines, Martha Norwalk's Animal World, Sunday morning, 9 a.m. to noon, right here on Alternative Talk, AM 1150.
180 over 111, and I had a stroke. I couldn't speak or walk.
This is high blood pressure. Get back on your plan. Go to loweryourhbp.org. Brought to you by the American Stroke Association, American Medical Association, and the Ad Council.
At Sundown Communications, we find that most of our clients are brilliant at what they do, but they lack the time and resources to write and create business messaging that delivers results. That's where we come in, providing a diverse range of professional copywriting services for fresh strategic web content, PR, advertising and promotion, marketing, speeches, and much more. Call us today so you can focus on what you do best, and we'll do the rest. Call 800-495-7617. That's 800-495-7617.
Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair airs live every Monday at noon. And now you can also catch the show during drive time at 6 a.m. every Friday. Hear from New York Times bestselling authors, innovative business leaders, cutting-edge health and wellness professionals, award-winning journalists, filmmakers, explorers, and adventurers. Tune in to Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair, Mondays at noon Pacific Time and Fridays at 6 a.m. right here on Alternative Talk 1150.
You're listening to Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair. Talk radio to help you heal and stay healthy.
Find our app in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and take us with you wherever you go. Alternative Talk AM 1150.
And welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Conversations Live with Vicki St. Clair. My guest is Sarah Smarsh. Her book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. And it's described as an eye-opening and startlingly observed story of working-class poverty by an extraordinary talent. And Sarah, I want to... as you're talking through the book, you are speaking to your imaginary child, and I know there was a reason for this, but would you share that why you took that approach?
Sure. You know, in terms of relationship to the themes of the book, kind of attempting to articulate things that, for me as a kid, I found very mysterious. I really wanted to, a group that I had in mind was just kids who are now in the role that I once was in, which is sort of helpless within the context of poverty that they're born into. And so this address that I'm giving to this would have been kid is also in some ways me talking to millions of kids in that station, and in some more psychological ways, probably me talking to my child self. And the hope was to validate their sense of self-worth, which I think is innate to every child. But if you are born with various identity factors stacked against you, in my case, it was economic and also my gender. For other kids, it might be their race or sexual orientation and so on. When you have a sense of your own self-worth that might be innate to any child, and yet you're moving through this society and culture that is continually attempting to tear that down, that inner sense of one's self-worth is so essential to maintain and hold on to, in spite of all the external messages to the contrary, for a happy life. So that's sort of a lofty goal, I suppose, in terms of communication and a humble book, but that was my hope.
Right, right. You write about the shame, the residue of shame of being poor and white. You say we failed our children, we failed these children. Would you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. You know, shame is a really hard emotion to pinpoint or to become aware of. So I think, you know, when I was a little kid or a teenager or a first-generation college student or even a young professional entering spaces that no one from my family had ever entered, I wasn't consciously thinking to myself, oh, I feel ashamed. I actually experienced myself as confident, and I always told myself, at least, that I deserved to be wherever I was, and I believed in myself. That said, with the vantage of a few more years, I can look back and see that absolutely I was carrying a deep sense of concern about the judgment that the world around me had for the place I was from, and therefore I very rationally presumed that same judgment might be directed at me. So, you know, when I say that we've failed our children in this country, I do mean in just the very raw elements of survival, from, you know, ensuring that all of our children are fed and taken care of, to the more psychological and deeper elements of a sense of belonging or worth, that while they are not at the base of, you know, the way that we envision a hierarchy of needs, they are nonetheless central to humanity and one's existence. So, you know, when I was in fifth grade, I said earlier in our conversation that we always had enough to eat. Well, kind of. It was precarious in some ways. So when I went to public school and my parents went to work, I qualified for free lunches through, of course, taxpayers' money. And we moved around so much that sometimes, like, the records of my immunizations or this and that would get lost in the shuffle of just of bureaucracy. And in fifth grade, I landed at a school where somehow my qualifying for the free lunch had not moved from point A to point B. And I don't know, my mom dropped me off on the first day and went off to work, and her concerns about putting food on the table at home. And I don't know, it was like they didn't have lunch for me, and I didn't have money for lunch, and I hadn't brought my lunch. And I was so embarrassed that I didn't say anything to anyone, and I actually spent that entire school year slinking off and hiding during lunch and not eating. So it's you know, that kind of gets at, I think, the relationship between shame and just the very most essential elements of a kid's survival.
Right, right. I know that one of the things you want to dispel, the myth that the conservative white man from coal country represents all working class, because he does not.
Yeah, you know, I actually even, I feel reluctant sometimes about being categorized as white working class, while that is absolutely my experience. I never want to participate in a conversation that is shining a brighter light on some aspect of the working class or the working poor than another aspect of it. So my corrective to those misleading narratives is that I am a woman and I'm from the Midwest, and you know, that same group though is diverse in a million ways, racially, in terms of religion and politics, and yet we have these sort of prevailing national narratives that envision working America as a white guy wearing a tool belt.
Right, right. We've only got about a minute left here. So much to talk about in this book. People are going to have great conversations around it, I'm sure. But you touch on a subject that's having such a huge and derogatory effect in America, across America, especially here in Seattle. And that's opioid addiction. And you write in Heartland, in your book, of Chris's experience. You say sometimes you found yourself judging her as a bad person. tell us who Chris is, and you say if Chris had failed, the system failed her more, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. So this opioid epidemic that's going on in the country began to present itself in my family many years ago, long before it was a national conversation or even acknowledged as a problem. The character in the book you're referencing is my stepmother. I think that she was prescribed opioids for the first time by some unscrupulous physician, like literally for menstrual cramps when she was 19. And so by the time I knew her as a young woman, my dad remarried when I was a kid, she was already struggling on that path, and with little to no, not just assistance, but validation that she even had a grievance about her own health concerns. And so in this hyper-individualistic society, a lot of people judged her for her behavior. And, while I've held great love and concern toward her, to myself, I think I sometimes, when I was myself a very young woman, thinking about that particular, what some people now call substance abuse disorder, and I would have called addiction, I put the onus about that on her. Now, with, I hope, a more sophisticated understanding of the way that things work in society, I see that actually that physician, who is now in jail, by the way, is where, as far as I'm concerned, every bit of the blame should fall.
Mm. Well, the book is an awesome read, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. Raises a lot of questions, challenges you to think differently. I really appreciate you being with us today, Sarah Smarsh. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki. This has been great.
And of course, Sarah is a journalist and author of Heartland. You can find out much more about her at her website, sarahsmarsh.com. We've got to run. We're right out of time. We'll see you next week. Until then, live well, live strong. Hi, this is Vicki St. Clair. If you have a business, service or event and would like to deliver your message to a large audience, call me at 425-269-4772. Let Conversations Live shine the spotlight on you. Call 425-269-4772.
The views expressed on this program are those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of KKNW, its management, or other advertisers. Contests are the responsibility of the host of this program and not KKNW. This is Alternative Talk 1150 AM, KKNW Seattle, and KNUC 98.9 HD3 Seattle.
Well, good afternoon. It's Eric Ryder here with you on Alternative Talk 1150 AM. We are headed towards 1 o'clock, and it's time once again to take a look at our traffic. Now, southbound I-5 from Northeast 45th on down to Mercer Street is slow. And on the east side, 405, finding a little bit of slowing between I-90 and Newcastle. A little more hesitation around Northeast 30th. Stay tuned to Alternative Talk 1150 AM. Coming up next, Mayo Clinic Radio. Right now, 59 degrees, expecting a high today of around 65 degrees. Here under sunny skies in beautiful Seattle.
Problems worsen. Hearing both sides. I'm Mike Moss. Winds have died down, rains have subsided, but problems are actually growing for residents of North Carolina trapped by rising floodwaters and shortages of things like gasoline.
I have a mama at the hospital now, and she needs dialysis, and they're trying to tell me they can't transport her from the hospital to right here. We don't have no gas. We're sitting in line. We've been sitting here since 7 this morning trying